Political and economic change. In contrast to Britain, Russia has almost always had difficulty with gradual and ordered change. Instead, its history reflects a resistance to change by reform and a tendency to descend into chaos or resort to revolution when contradictory forces meet. The most successful Tsars, such as Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, understood the dangers of chaos in Russia, and often resorted to force in order to keep their power. The 19th century Tsars faced the infiltration of Enlightenment ideas of democracy and individual rights, and those who tried reforms that allowed gradual inclusion of these influences failed. For example, Alexander II, who freed Russian serfs and experimented with local assemblies, was assassinated by revolutionaries in 1881. The forces that led to his assassination later blossomed into full-blown revolution: the execution of the last Tsar and the establishment of a communist regime. Likewise, the late 19th century Tsars' attempt to gradually industrialize Russia were largely unsuccessful, but Joseph Stalin's 5-year plans that called for rapid, abrupt economic change led to the establishment of the Soviet Union as one of the two superpowers that dominated the world for half a century after the conclusion of World War II. In the late 20th century, Mikhail Gorbachev's attempts to reform the political and economic systems failed. Russia's history is characterized by 3 distinct time periods: a long period of autocratic rule by Tsars. Tsars ruled Russia from the 14th to the early 20th century. Control of Russia was passed down to the Romanov family from the 17th century on, but transitions were often accompanied by brutality and sometimes assassination. 20th century rule by the Communist Party. Communist rule began in 1917 when Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks seized control of the government after the last Tsar, Nicholas II, was deposed. The regime toppled in 1991 when a failed coup from within the government created chaos. An abrupt regime change to procedural democracy and a free market in 1991. President Boris Yeltsin put Western-style reforms in place to create the Russian Federation. Since 2000, Vladimir Putin has dominated Russian government and politics, limiting democratic reforms. The 2 transition periods between the major time periods were sparked by revolution and quick, dramatic change. The Slavic influence has brought some continuity to Russia's history, but in general, change has rarely been evolutionary and gradual. Instead, long periods of authoritarian rule have been punctuated by protest and violence. Tsarist rule. The first Tsars were princes of Moscow, who cooperated with their 13th century Mongol rulers, and in return for their assistance were rewarded with land and power. But when Mongol rule weakened, the princes declared themselves Tsars in the tradition of the Caesars of ancient Rome. The Tsars were autocratic from the beginning, and tightly controlled their lands in order to protect them from invasion and attack. The Tsars also headed the Russian Orthodox Church, so that they were seen as both political and religious leaders. Early Russia was isolated from Western Europe by its orientation to the Eastern Orthodox world, and long distances separated Russian cities from major civilizations to the south and east. Western influence. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Tsar Peter the Great introduced Western technology and culture in an attempt to increase Russia's power and influence. From his early childhood, he was intrigued by the West, and he became the first Tsar to travel to Germany, Holland, and England. There he learned about shipbuilding and other types of technology. He brought engineers, carpenters, and architects to Russia, and set the country on a course toward world power. Catherine the Great, who originally came from Germany, ruled Russia during the late 18th century, and managed to gain warm water access to the Black Sea, an accomplishment that had eluded Peter. Both looked to the West to help develop their country, but neither abandoned absolute rule. Catherine read widely and was very interested in Enlightenment thought, but she checked any impulses she had to apply them to her rule. Instead, she became an enlightened despot, or one who rules absolutely, but with clear goals for the country in mind. Tsars after Peter and Catherine alternated between emphasizing Slavic roots and tolerating Western-style reform, although none of them successfully responded to the revolutionary movement growing within their country during the 19th century. 19th century Tsars. Russia was brought into direct contact with the West when Napoleon invaded in 1812. Alexander I successfully resisted the attack, but at great cost to the empire. Western thought influenced Russian intellectuals who saw no room for Western political institutions to grow under the Tsar's absolutism. Their frustration erupted in the Decembrist Revolution of 1825, which was crushed ruthlessly by Nicholas I. By mid-century, the Russian defeat in the Crimean War convinced many of the Tsar's critics that Russian ways were indeed backward and in need of major reform. 19th century Tsars reacted to their demands by sending the secret police to investigate and by exiling or executing the dissenters. Of all the 19th century Tsars, the only one who seriously sponsored reform was Alexander II. However, even though he freed Russian serfs and set up regional zemstvos, assemblies, the increasingly angry intelligentsia did not think his actions went far enough. Alexander II was assassinated in 1881 by his critics, and his son, Alexander III, reacted by undoing the reforms and intensifying the efforts of the secret police. The Revolution of 1917, Lenin, and Stalin. The most immediate cause of the Revolution of 1917 was Russia's ineffectiveness in fighting the Russo-Japanese War and World War I. Tsar Nicholas II was indeed in the wrong place at the wrong time, but he was also a weak ruler who had no control over the armies. The first signs of the revolution were in 1905, when riots and street fighting broke out in protest to Russian losses in the war with Japan. The Tsar managed to put the revolution down, but the state finally collapsed in 1917 in the midst of World War I. Russian soldiers were fighting without guns or shoes, and mass defections from the war front helped send the state into chaos. Lenin and the Bolsheviks. By the 1890s, some of the revolutionists in Russia were Marxists, who were in exile along with other dissidents. However, according to Marxism, socialist revolution would take first place not in Russia, but in capitalist countries like Germany, France, and England. At the turn of the century, Russia was still primarily an agricultural society, with little industrial development. In his 1905 pamphlet, What is to be Done?, Vladimir Lenin changed the meaning of Marxism when he argued for democratic centralism, the idea of a vanguard leadership group that would lead the revolution because the people could not organize it themselves. Lenin believed that the situation in Russia was so bad that the revolution could occur even though it was a non-industrialized society. Lenin's followers came to call themselves the Bolsheviks, and they took control of the government in late 1917. In 1922, Russia was renamed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In 1918, a civil war broke out between the White Army, led by Russian military leaders and funded by the Allied powers, and the Red Army, led by Lenin. The Reds won, and in 1920, Lenin instituted his new economic policy, which allowed a great deal of private ownership to exist under a centralized leadership. The plan brought relative prosperity to farmers, but did not promote industrialization. Would Lenin have moved on to a more socialist approach? No one knows, because Lenin died in 1924 before his plans unfolded, and before he could name a successor. A power struggle followed, and Joseph Stalin, the man of steel, won control and led the country to the heights of totalitarianism. Stalinism. Stalin vastly changed Lenin's democratic centralism, also known as Marxism-Leninism. Stalin placed the Communist Party at the center of control and allowed no other political parties to compete with it. Party members were carefully selected, with only about 7% of the population actually joining. Communists ran local, regional, and national governments, and leaders were identified and promoted through nomenklatura, or the process of party membership selecting promising recruits from the lower levels. Most top government officials also belonged to the Central Committee, a group of party leaders who met twice a year. Above the Central Committee was the Politburo, the heart and soul of the Communist Party. This group of about 12 men ran the country, and their decisions were carried out by government agencies and departments. The head of the Politburo was the General Secretary, who assumed full power as dictator of the country. Joseph Stalin was the General Secretary of the Communist Party from 1927 until his death in 1953. Collectivization and industrialization. Stalin's economic plan for the USSR had two parts: collectivization and industrialization. Stalin replaced the small private farms of the NEP with collective farms that were state-run and supposedly more efficient. Private land ownership was done away with, and the farms were intended to feed workers in the cities who contributed to the industrialization of the nation. Some peasants resisted, particularly those who owned large farms. These kulaks were forced to move to cities or to labor camps, and untold numbers died at the hands of government officials. With the agricultural surplus from the farms, Stalin established his first 5-year plan, which set ambitious goals for production of heavy industry, such as oil, steel, and electricity. Other plans followed, and all were carried out for individual factories by Gosplan, the Central State Planning Commission. Gosplan became the nerve center for the economy, determining production and distribution of virtually all goods in the Soviet Union. Stalinism, then, is this two-pronged program of collectivization and industrialization, carried out by central planning and executed with force and brutality. Stalin's foreign policy. During the 1930s, Stalin's primary focus was internal development, so his foreign policy was intended to support that goal. He advocated socialism in one country, to emphasize his split with traditional Marxist emphasis on international revolution, and he tried to ignore the fascist threat from nearby Germany and Italy. Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in 1939, only to be attacked by Germany the following year. Russia then joined sides with the Allies for the duration of World War II, but tensions between East and West were often apparent at conferences, and as soon as the war ended, the situation escalated into the Cold War. These significant shifts in foreign policy all accommodated his main goal, the industrial development of the USSR. The Purges. Joseph Stalin is perhaps best known for his purges, the execution of millions of citizens, including up to 1 million party members. He became obsessed with disloyalty in the party ranks, and he ordered the execution of his own generals and other members of the Politburo and Central Committee. Stalin held total power, and by the time of his death in 1953, some speculated that he'd gone mad. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, set about to reform Stalinism by loosening its totalitarian nature and publicly denouncing the purges. Reform under Khrushchev and Gorbachev. After Stalin died in 1953, a power struggle among top Communist Party leaders resulted in the choice of Nikita Khrushchev as party secretary and premier of the USSR. In 1956, he gave his famous secret speech, in which he revealed the existence of a letter written by Lenin before he died. The letter was critical of Stalin, and Khrushchev used it to denounce Stalin's rules and practices, particularly the purges that he sponsored. This denouncement led to de-Stalinization, a process that brought about reforms such as loosening government censorship of the press, decentralization of economic decision-making, and restructuring of collective farms. In foreign policy, Khrushchev advocated peaceful coexistence, or relaxation of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. He was criticized from the beginning for the suggested reforms, and his diplomatic and military failure in the Cuban Missile Crisis ensured his removal from power. Furthermore, most of his reforms did not appear to be working by the early 1960s. He was replaced by the much more conservative Leonid Brezhnev, who ended the reforms and tried to cope with the growing number of economic problems that were just under the surface of Soviet power. After Brezhnev died in 1982, power fell to two short-lived successors, who were in turn replaced in 1985 by a reformer from a younger generation, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev was unlike any previous Soviet leader in that he not only looked and acted more Western, but he was also more open to Western-style reforms than his predecessors, including Khrushchev. Gorbachev inherited far more problems than any outsider realized at the time, and many of his reforms were motivated by sheer necessity to save the country from economic disaster. His program was three-pronged. Glasnost. This term translates from the Russian as openness. It allowed more open discussion of political, social, and economic issues, as well as open criticism of the government. Although his reform was applauded by Western nations and many Russians, it caused many problems for Gorbachev. After so many years of repression, people vented hostility toward the government that encouraged open revolt, particularly from among some of the republics that wanted independence from Soviet control. Democratization. Gorbachev believed that he could keep the old Soviet structure, including the Communist Party control, but at the same time insert a little democracy into the system. Two such moves included the creation of 1. A new Congress of People's Deputies with directly elected representatives, and 2. A new position of President that was selected by the Congress. However, many of the new deputies were critical of Gorbachev, increasing the level of discord within the government. Perestroika. This economic reform was Gorbachev's most radical and also his least successful. Again, he tried to keep the old Soviet structure and modernize from within. Most significantly, it transferred many economic powers held by the central government to private hands and the market economy. Specific reforms included authorization of some privately owned companies, penalties for underperforming state factories, leasing of farmland outside the collective farms, and price reforms, and encouragement of joint ventures with foreign companies. None of Gorbachev's reforms were ever fully carried out because the revolution of 1991 swept him out of office. A failed coup in the revolution of 1991. In August 1991, conservatives, those that wanted to abandon Gorbachev's reforms, several high-ranking Communist Party and government officials led a coup d'etat that tried to remove Gorbachev from office. The leaders included the vice president, the head of the KGB, the Russian secret police, and top military advisors. The coup failed when popular protests broke out, and soldiers from the military defected rather than support their leaders. The protesters were led by Boris Yeltsin, the elected president of the Russian Republic and former Politburo member. Yeltsin had been removed from the Politburo a few years earlier because his radical views offended conservatives. He advocated more extreme reform measures than Gorbachev did, and he won his position as president of the Russian Republic as a result of new voting procedures put in place by Gorbachev. Gorbachev was restored to power, but the USSR only had a few months to live. By December 1991, 11 republics had declared their independence, and eventually Gorbachev was forced to announce the end of the Soviet Union, which put him out of a job. The 15 republics went their separate ways, but Boris Yeltsin emerged as the president of the largest and most powerful republic, now renamed the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation, 1991 to the present. Once the revolution of 1991 was over, Boris Yeltsin proceeded with his plans to create a Western-style democracy. The old Soviet structure was destroyed, but the same problems that haunted Gorbachev were still there. The Constitution of 1993 created a three-branch government with a president, a prime minister, and lower legislative house called the Duma, and a constitutional court. Conflict erupted between Yeltsin and the Duma, and the Russian economy did not immediately respond to the shock therapy, an immediate market economy, that the government prescribed. Yeltsin also proved to be a much poorer president than he was a revolutionary leader. His frequent illnesses and alcoholism almost certainly explained the erratic behavior that led him to hire and fire prime ministers in quick succession. Yeltsin resigned in the months before the election of 2000, and Prime Minister Vladimir Putin became acting president. Although Putin supported Yeltsin's reforms, he was widely seen as a more conservative leader who many hoped would bring stability to the newly formed government. As his presidency progressed, Putin retreated significantly from the commitments that Yeltsin had made to the establishment of a democratic system. The fact that he honored the Constitution of 1993 by stepping down as president at the end of his second term is countered by his remaining on as prime minister, and most believe that he still controlled policymaking in Russia. The Constitution allowed Putin to run for president again in 2012, and his decision to run shapes the path that Russia takes as it balances its authoritarian past with democratization trends of the present.